Although you get some of the better views on the edges or on the summits, those areas are also quite exposed and can be hit hard by the wind. So something like this, a flimsy little shepherd's hook, is not going to be as secure as one of these style of pegs. So when you pull on this one, the other peg securing it stops it pulling out of the ground. So I've seen a few videos on YouTube and posts on social media where people have had to bail from a wild camp due to the tent failing. So most people aren't using tents that are designed for really harsh conditions. But there are things that we can all do that'll give your tent a better chance of making it through the night. So the first thing that you can do to make sure that your shelter is going to get you through the night is to not specifically go out in really windy conditions. Check the weather forecast first. If you've got a cheaper or more budget tent, the likelihood is it's not going to be as strong as some of the more expensive tents. Tents like this have got superior materials. This one is type 66 nylon, which is high tenacity, very resistant to tearing. But on some of the cheaper made tents, I have seen where people just tripping over a guy line will actually tear the material. So if it's really windy, choose somewhere sensible to pitch your tent. Although you get some of the better views on the edges or on the summits, those areas are also quite exposed and can be hit hard by the wind. Pitching your tent somewhere like this gives you an incredible view. But if the wind picks up, you really are exposed. You are much better off finding somewhere that's sheltered, unless you've got a tent that is really capable in windy conditions. So we're not expecting really high winds today, but I had planned to pitch the tent behind another big rock about a mile further along the edge. But when I got there, someone had beat me to it. So it's always a good idea to have a backup plan when it comes to pitch locations. Hey, so this is where I was gonna pitch. Someone's nicked it.
You right, people? How are we doing?
This is Lewis. So, believe it or not, last time I was up Bamford Edge, is it 3 or 4 weeks ago, something like that?
Yeah, about that.
Yeah, Lewis was up there then and bumped into us, so it's a very small world. He's come all the way from Liverpool on the train, Scouser, yeah.
Scouser on tour.
So yeah, so I'm going to have to go and find somewhere else now, so Lewis has got this place to himself. But anyway, we've got a nice little pitch nestled behind these big rocks here, which will give us a decent amount of protection from the wind. So if you've managed to find a nice sheltered spot, the next thing you can do is make sure that you pitch your tent correctly. So make sure all of your pegs are in securely, all of your tie-out points are pegged down. Poles, it's important to make sure that poles are buttered up correctly. Any sort of gap like that can lead to snaps in your poles. Try and ensure that your guy lines are fully extended so they're at the maximum length possible. You want your tent to be clamped to the ground like a limpet on a rock. So while we're talking tent pegs, not all tent pegs are equal. So something like this, a flimsy little shepherd's hook, is not going to be as secure as one of these style of pegs. I also find the longer the peg, the more secure it is in the ground. However, it's often more difficult to get a longer peg in. So these particular tents are quite expensive titanium ones. These aren't designed for securing a tent to the ground. They're more for just pegging a door closed or open. I recommend a 6-inch plus chunky peg. You do get different pegs for different ground conditions, for sand and snow as well. I will link a video in the description from one that I watched a few months back, and it was really informative about different types of tent peg. Sometimes if it's really windy and your tent's flapping around and maybe the ground's soft, a peg can be ripped out of the ground, and this can have really damaging effects on your tent. So if it's really windy, I double up with the pegs and an extra bit of guy line. So it's quite straightforward to do. First peg goes in, then you get another little bit of guy rope. This one's got 2 bowline knots on the end. Just put it over your peg and then peg that one out a little further back. And what that does is it takes some of the pressure off this peg. So when you pull on this one, the other peg securing it stops it pulling out of the ground. You can do this as well with just a little bit of cord that you've got. So you can just wrap it round in there. If not, put another one in there. And that does the same thing. Tighten that up. There we go. Make sure that these are down along the ground and everything's in firmly. You don't need to do this on every guy out point, but if the wind's battering one side, then it's wise to do that side, especially on your guy lines. I always take some spare guy line or some guy line cord. So if things are really taking a battering, I can add a little bit more guy rope on there, come from a slightly different angle, and I've got twice the strength of guy line on here. There may be areas that require a little bit of extra support that you can put a small amount of guy line from. But bear in mind, the aim of the game is not to make your tent too rigid. The flexibility of this tent is one of the main reasons that, that keeps it standing in high winds. Things that are too stiff can break. So you're pitched in the shelter, everything is guyed out properly. You've got your tent set up as securely as you can get it. One thing that could possibly fail though is that your tent leaks. Now you would expect tents to come from the factory waterproof. Those cheap £20 festival tents from Tesco's, I wouldn't bother with those. They're not gonna survive a torrential rainstorm. But if you've got a sil nylon tent, it may have come from the factory and not be waterproof. So sil nylon requires seam sealing. Because it's silicone coated both sides, these seams can't be taped. So a lot of tents have on the inside, they'll have a waterproof taping which waterproofs all of the seams. But the tape doesn't stick to silicone, so you do have to seam seal these tents with a silicone solution or paste. It's quite straightforward to do. You just have to brush it over all of the stitch seams. You can sometimes pay a fee from the manufacturer to get them to do it for you. From my experience, you're better off doing it yourself. Save yourself 40 or 50 quid and you will do a better job. It might not be as pretty as the manufacturers, but it will be more waterproof. I haven't yet seam sealed this tent, but we're not due any rain tonight, so fingers crossed anyway. But I will be doing that in the near future. While we're on about the stitching, I've seen on some really high-end tents, they use really special fine needles. The stitches, when they penetrate, they're that small that like the hole just seals up again after the stitch has gone in. So I think Hilleberg used that sort of sewing technology, and therefore their tents, they don't actually need seam sealing when it is a double side silicone fabric. So we've pitched the tent the best we can in the best location we can. Fingers crossed you never have to bail during a camp. But if you are really worried about the weather conditions, you think there's a possibility that you've got to bail, it's a really good idea to, once you're in your tent, get as much of your stuff packed away. Just have the bare minimum out to get you through the night, your sleeping pad, your sleeping bag. You don't need all of your cook set and radios and stuff like that. Have those things already packed in your bag, and then if the worst happens, you've only got to put a few things away and then you can get off and get home.